Hey, and welcome to Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I'm your host. It's great to be with you. Head on over to the Patreon. We actually have another video live there. The first one was on kind of what was going on with Matt Chandler. It looks like he's coming back from his break at the Village. And this latest one was on Guy Mason at City on a Hill Church in Australia, and some controversy that happened there regarding his president of the board getting fired from a soccer club because of Christian beliefs. That's behind the paywall for now. So head on over to the Patreon. The link is in the show notes. You can sign up there. Well, today I wanted to do kind of a more of a personal story on my experience with a particular thought leader within evangelicalism. And the reason I want to do it is not kind of a diary entry. It's more of a sharing with you to maybe help you put some pieces together, because I wasn't able to put some pieces together of what was going on in evangelicalism and in Christian culture in America. And so I just want to kind of give a brief synopsis of my perspective now, looking back on where I've been for the last 6 years regarding this one particular figure, and that figure is Russell Moore. And so just to kind of set the stage right off the bat, anytime I publicly kind of take up or take issue with something Moore says, and I try not to attack his character or question his salvation, but I simply disagree with his proposals and his ideas for Christianity and for our society. Invariably, I get a direct message or a message from somebody being like, why did you do that? Like, he's a good guy. Why are you doing this? And, that's fair enough. That's the way people behave in tribes. And so I understand why they are perturbed by my critique. And I think the same thing is true of Tim Keller. When James Wood's article came out on Tim Keller, or not, it wasn't on Tim Keller, it was on kind of the winsome approach to politics and Christianity. He got all sorts of flack for kind of doing that. And so in my head, the way I was thinking about this episode particularly is I remember listening to kind of the first critique of Tim Keller's approach that I had heard from Aaron Wren. And I remember exactly where I was. We were driving back from kind of seeing some family for the holiday in Texas. We were just south of Oklahoma City. And at the time, I was listening to The Masculinist, which is now the Aaron Wren Show. And he was offering a perspective on Tim Keller. And I can put a link to that in the show notes. It's a very good episode. And what Aaron does is he tries to show, look, we can appreciate who he is and the time and place he existed within, and also acknowledge there are some kind of vulnerabilities with his approach to ministry. And I just thought that was really helpful. I probably can't do it as well as Aaron in terms of Aaron's his craft was a consultant, and so he can be pretty plain. I get a little bit more excited. In fact, I actually recorded this episode 2 days ago, and I was just getting way too kind of redlining with my emotions. So that episode will never see the light of day. So I wanted to kind of do a redo. First, I want to kind of recap, who is Russell Moore? Well, right now, Russell Moore is the editor-in-chief at Christianity Today. And I'm sure it's somewhat of a dream job for Russell Moore, because he wrote his dissertation on Carl F.H. Henry, who was one of the founders of Christianity Today back in the mid-20th century. And so it feels like he's coming kind of into his own, something he's been doing for a while. Before that, he was the director of Christianity Today's Public Theology Project. I've seen him interacting at the University of Chicago often recently as well. Before that, he was the president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention, the ERLC. And so that is the kind of the arm of the Southern Baptist Convention that is focused on political engagement. It's like a political action kind of deal where they send ERLC reps to advocate for Southern Baptist issues before the government. And so and they also write and publish material that's helpful. So, for example, when Obergefell got passed, they released a whole document on what you could add to your church bylaws and statement of faith to protect you from any lawsuits or anything like that. In fact, our church actually used some of that language as well. And before that, he was the provost and dean at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville. And so he taught theology and ethics. And he grew up in Mississippi, and from what I understand of his biography, he was kind of interested in politics in high school. At that point in Mississippi, it was more Democrat. Uh, so I don't know if that is a something he walked away from and is walking back to. I don't know where that starting point ended up for him, but I just know that that's where he started out. So right now he's the editor in chief of Christianity Today. As far as kind of like my own appreciation of him, I started noticing his writing when I was in seminary, and I wanted some thinking on public theology, and he was typically a voice I would listen to. His book Onward came out in 2015. It was on, I mean, the subtitle is Engaging the Culture Without Losing the Gospel. I've got a copy of it here. Um, and so he wants to really push back on like the religious right, and he also doesn't want us to pull back into isolation. So at the time, I thought it was a really helpful book. In fact, in my notes in here, I show connections with James Davidson Hunter, who I also thought was very helpful. He wrote a book called To Change the World. Um, in fact, 2019, Russell Moore was the main stage speaker. He did about 4 sessions at the 2019 Acts 29 kind of conference, annual conference. And so I got Russell Moore to sign. You can't see it on the video. There it is. Got him to sign my book. I think I got a picture with him too. And so Russell Moore was a big kind of name for me. And I didn't understand when people criticized him. I was very perplexed when people criticized him. A good example is back in 2016. I saw Doug Wilson getting after Russell Moore on his blog, and that really perplexed me. I was like, what is Wilson's deal? Like, why does he keep attacking who I believe to be allies? Like, why isn't he more like ready to play ball with people who are obviously opposed to Obergefell and are Christian? Why would he not be more open to Russ Moore? And so I was perturbed by this I mean, obviously through 2019, I was still kind of like following Russ Moore, thinking, okay, this is a good, reliable person. Even when he was critiqued, uh, I was like, well, he just has a different perspective. In fact, I heard one legendary story where after 2016, he pretty much, I mean, he is a true never Trumper, and he made that known. And he wrote articles about this, right? He wrote things like in First Things in 2017, can the religious right be saved? He wrote in 2016, May 6, 2016, in the New York Times, a white church no more. And so he's criticizing a lot, uh, and that's his prerogative. It's odd to do that as the kind of leader of the ERLC. You're criticizing your base. Evangelicals, presumably Southern Baptists, showed up in big numbers for Trump, and are more aligned with the religious right. And so for him to go public criticizing his own constituency so hard, it would make sense why so many of his own constituency would not appreciate that. And I think there was one story where he had to go fly down to Dallas and apologize to a prominent Southern Baptist pastor for some of the things he said. And so I was very much in the Moore camp, so to speak, kind of following him. And that's when 2020 hit, and that really kind of shook things up for everyone. And so I started reevaluating some of the stuff he was saying and paying attention. And so, like, for me, Russell Moore was like, man, what does he think about coronavirus? What does he think about, all the things going on with race in America, all this stuff? And what I found was just kind of was a person who was just kind of towing the line in terms of not really questioning. In fact, he was still doubling down on his critique of his own constituency. And that's part of what led him to leave the Southern Baptist. And this was the thing that really revealed something to me. So in the Southern Baptist convention, there's been a big in-house debate about abuse cover-up, and wherever that's happened, that's awful, and there needs to be corrections made and policies updated to deal with it. And so Russell Moore was he's a big leader in the ERLC, and they've different in the SBC. They've got lots of committees and executive committees, all this stuff. And so as he's leaving the Southern Baptist, he's about to go kind of get a dream job at Christianity Today. Now he's the editor-in-chief. So his career is not being threatened. In fact, that's what's funny is like somebody who's so willing to criticize his own constituency in the highest echelons of like the New York Times. You know that person is not afraid of kind of like losing their job. Like they're going to be taken care of. And so he wrote a letter to, I think he was President Greer, who used to be, Summit Church used to be Acts 29 until I guess they got Greer aside in the SBC and were like, hey, if you want to be president, you need to leave Acts 29. That's speculative, but that's what it seemed like to me. And so he wrote a letter to Greer, and the letter just reads like it was meant to be leaked. And so the letter was written in 2021 on his way out, and he's talking about how there's all this abuse cover up, how he was in the meetings where abuse was being covered up, blah, 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 blah. And he goes on. And everything in the language reads as if it's a public statement, but the letter itself is like, Dear Mr. Greer, and it's supposed to be something that's like private correspondence, but it looks like it was intended to be leaked. And look, I get that you may not view it that way. That's your call. But if you kind of know how politics works and know how political thinkers work, that's kind of a thing that happens. Well, in the letter, what's ironic is that he criticizes the abuse, or what he perceives as a covering up of abuse within the SBC, but he was part of that team. He was like in those meetings. And so he had the opportunity to do something about it, but instead of actually doing something about it, if it's true, he decides to like go scorched earth on the way out. And so that's, to me, was like the thing where I was like, I don't think I can trust this guy. I don't think this guy's trustworthy. I don't think his intentions are very transparent. I don't think he's being honest with what he wants. And so some other things that were going on in 2020 was he was talking about kind of like rejoicing in the death of Christian culture dying. And this is right in line with like what Ray Ortlund was saying. So Russell Moore said that the decline of Christian culture is both good for the church and good for the church's engagement with the outside world, because in a post-Christian culture, it is less likely that the faith will be invoked to advance some worldly end. Ray Ortlund said, I rejoice at the decline of Bible Belt religion. It made bad people worse in the name of Jesus. And so these guys are they have a very low estimation of Christian culture. And that was what really tipped my hand as someone who's living in Boulder, ministering in Boulder, watching what's going on. And I'm in a church parking lot, worshiping with my children and my wife. And I'm like, you know what I would give to be in a state, in a place where we could worship in a building with kids programming, with Awanas, with Christian music. Do you know what I would give for Christian culture to raise my family in? Like, I would give a lot. Like that's a really good thing for people, and for them to just kind of like double down on like, thank God Christian culture's dying. That to me was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. And all of a sudden I started looking back at all the stuff that Moore had said and done, and it made me realize. I started to look back at all the stuff he had said and done, and it made me realize this guy's not operating in good faith. In fact, his vision for cultural engagement, it's very much like an anti-vision, in that it's one of abdication and retreat. It's the same attitude where the best place for the church to be is under persecution. The best place for Christians to be is suffering. And so these people that kind of advocate for this viewpoint, they're very okay with kind of this attitude of like Christians shouldn't have any kind of vision for self-assertion, for self-preservation. There shouldn't be any kind of like, when you vote, there should, in their mind, there should be no attitude towards, I'm going to vote for things that will help me. In their mind, that's selfish and sinful. And so there's a huge disconnect there. All this kind of gets up to this past week where Russell Moore wrote an article in Christianity Today, and on Thursday it went behind the paywall, which really stinks. So I'm only going to get part of it. And that's what I tried to read earlier this week. I tried to do a live reading of this, and that's where I just got too animated. And so there's this article in Christianity Today. I'll link to it. I refused to unsubscribed when they released the article on Steve Timmis. And it says, what's wrong with winsomeness? What's Wrong with Winsomeness? That's the title of the article. And so up at the top, it's quoting some people about criticizing winsomeness and criticizing their opponents. There's no evidence of who these people are. In fact, if it is talking about anyone that I would know that's talked at like NatCon or anything like that, it doesn't resemble anything I've ever heard. And so his suggestion is that people who want to fight the culture war, they are trying to get rid of, Christian virtue. And it's just odd. It's not something I've heard. And so in one of these paragraphs, it says the idea that kindness, gentleness, endurance, and self-control don't work anymore comes up often. A common critique of evangelical pastor Tim Keller is that his patient explanation of the gospel, his belligerence against sin but not sinners, works in a neutral culture of the past, but not in a hostile culture like this one. Setting aside the question of whether New York City in the late modern age could be considered neutral to evangelical culture, the larger point is that the idea of a culture neutral to Christianity is itself a liberalizing religion. And so what he's trying to critique is, look, these people who are anti-winsome, if you want to call them that, and they're not, some of these people that are critiquing winsome actually do it in a very winsome way, come to find out. They're not questioning if we should follow Jesus and all of his teachings. They're questioning if we're actually following Jesus enough. They're saying, look, yes, like all the fruit of the Spirit and all the ethics that Jesus taught us. And what about all the other things in the Bible that we see? What about the other kind of attitudes? And so he does this funny thing, and this is where Aaron Wren really hits the nail on the head. And these were some observations he shared where he talks about Moore operating like a fundamentalist. And that's what's changed with Moore, and that's what I've noticed with Moore. And when I look back and he's kind of the same fundamentalist attitude. He has it, but what's changed with him are what are the fundamentals, right? The fundament, what is forming his world. And so for him, like right here, to think that pretend Christianity, claiming the goals of Jesus while ditching his ways, embracing Christian values without individual new birth. So right now, he's saying that people who pursue or claim the goals of Jesus and embrace Christian values he's claiming they're not actually Christians, pretend Christians. To claim that pretend Christianity is somehow closer to Christ than is outright paganism is the opposite of what Jesus himself told us. That reference, he references Matthew 21:31. I was looking it up and I do not see why he's referencing that passage. And in fact, I don't understand this critique at all. I mean, I understand it from his perspective. He's saying that, look, cultural Christianity is not somehow better than outright paganism. And so this is a common critique of his. He's saying pretend Christians. Cultural Christians are pretend Christians. They're nominal Christians. And for him, these are the worst people in the world. Not the people who are trying to put puberty blockers in kids and trying to kill babies in the womb. No, those aren't the worst people in the world. Those aren't the people that are the most egregious in terms of ethics. And this is a guy who taught ethics. So like you would think he would know this, but no, for him, those people aren't in terms of like gradation of sin. Those people aren't sinning in a worse way. In fact, he thinks the people that are claiming Christ but aren't really regenerate are worse than the outright paganism. And so this is just a fundamental disagreement that I have with his idea of what it means to engage the culture and engage the world. And this attitude shapes a lot of the way he views things. He's going to constantly berate Christian culture, people who are culturally Christian. And I understand that critique. I grew up in Dallas. I know and I understand what he's critiquing. But I'm telling you that it would be better for my grandchildren to be raised in a nominally Christian culture than an outright pagan culture, because in a nominally Christian culture, they're going to have a better opportunity to honor God and become regenerate. And for him, for Moore, he thinks the opposite, right? He thinks it would be better if everything was outright pagan, because then that would just clearly show who the Christians are and who they aren't. And I get that. I'm in Boulder. Like that's something that a lot of people that come to Boulder, they reflect on that. They say, well, at least we know where people land. And so it can be refreshing in some sense when you're doing ministry in that kind of context, because there's not a lot of nominal Christians in Boulder, right? And so I get his frustration. I just think he's misreading the Bible and misreading how Christianity shapes culture and how culture shapes politics and all these things. And so he's accusing people that are attacking winsomeness of getting rid of uh, Christ-like virtue, which that's not what I've seen. I've just seen people questioning the strategy, and I think this gets on a key point, and I think this is where I kind of want to wrap it up. Is that the winsome crowd, and maybe some of you listening are part of this winsome crowd. Winsomeness is a strategy. Now, if you're in the winsome crowd, you hate that. Like, you think winsomeness is biblical. Like, it is what the Bible teaches. Oh my gosh, that is exactly what we're supposed to do. We should have a winsome witness trademark in the world, and we should engage the culture without any kind of hostility. We should constantly, kind of float the harder doctrines on easier doctrines. If we're in a secular culture, we're going to say certain things to appeal to certain audiences before we introduce other ideas that maybe call them sinners. And so you think that winsomeness is what the Bible teaches. And I'm calling into question that very paradigm. And I get that rattles a lot of people. And I understand why that's upsetting. But winsomeness was a strategy invented in the 80s and 90s, and kind of this evangelical conservatism, whether it was RTS, Winsomely Reformed, and other places. It was a strategy developed to engage culture in a way that wasn't so combative. In a big way, this is what evangelicalism in the mid 20th century was founded on. This idea that if we want to win people, we need them to respect our ideas, and we need to be seen as respectable. And so we're going to start Christianity today, and we're going to engage the culture with respect. But what they're not noticing is that they keep drifting as the culture drifts. So the way they determine respect is on, they're only going to touch on the things that the predominant secular elite are going to put up with. And so they're constantly, their positioning on how they engage issues is constantly shifting based on how the culture is going. And so that's why in 2020, when none of these guys were being honest, or they weren't really being helpful to churches when they talked about, race in America or coronavirus, they were just kind of like towing the line. It's because they're motivated by getting the respect of the world. That's what they're motivated by. And I look at my own heart, and like, that's what that is some of what was motivating me when I was in the winsome perspective, because I thought that ministry in Boulder, we could get more people in the door if we showed that we're respectable Christians and we're not like those dumb Christians that you see on TV. We're not those other Christians from your fundamentalist church. We're the cool Christians. And I would have never said that. But that's, when I look back on it, that was a lot of the grid through which I was evaluating how we're going to do ministry here. And so the winsomeness thing developed in the 90s as a strategy for cultural engagement. And if you can't see that, here's the thing for me. If you still don't believe me that it's a strategy, I want you to take the winsomeness paradigm that you believe to be biblical, and then I want you to evaluate two things. One, the prophets in the Bible, and two, church history. Because if you take your winsomeness paradigm as the only way to engage culture, and then you look at church history and you look at how Luther talked or John Knox talked, or how men fought and died over certain doctrinal matters. And if your winsomeness paradigm would geld and neuter all the reformers from ever having any kind of combative stance or taking a stand for truth, then that reveals to me that it is a current modern or postmodern strategy for cultural engagement. And if it is a strategy, if that's true, then it is totally fine to revisit that strategy and see how either we can improve upon it or get rid of some things that need to be got rid of. The same thing happens when you look at the Bible. You use the winsomeness paradigm. If you think that's the Bible and you look at the Bible, you use it as the lens to look at the prophets in the Old Testament and how they spoke about other nations, how they spoke about their own nation. And if your winsomeness paradigm would make them violators of the Bible itself and how they spoke, then that your paradigm is revealed to be a strategy, not the Bible. So winsomeness is not some fruit of the Spirit. It's not listed in the Bible. It's simply a word that's a strategic word to summarize an attitude of cultural engagement. And with that said, it's highly ironic that the people most sensitive to this critique are the very people who created the winsomeness model out of an attitude of contextualization. Pulling on Leslie Newbegin, they wanted to pull from this idea that we need to engage the post-Christian West in new ways, and therefore we need to create new strategies to engage it, and they come up with winsomeness, and then you go, maybe times have changed again. Maybe you need to reevaluate the strategies. Well, as soon as you question their strategy, they act like it's the Bible when they're the very ones that came up with a strategy for engaging a post-Christian culture and then named it winsome. And so for them to kind of act like fundamentalists, and this gets back to Ren's critique, they act like fundamentalists when it comes to their own strategies. And they read into the Bible this winsomeness paradigm that may or may not be true in some places, as if it's the only way for cultural engagement. It's like, no, like you guys were the very ones that were talking about contextualization and all this stuff, that we need to develop new strategies to engage the post-Christian West, and how are we going to engage it? And you came up with a word, and now you're acting like that's the only way. And it's like, dude, like God is always leading his church to engage the world in a way that is both biblically rooted and faithful, but also meets the times for what they are. And so that's the big critique with Moore. You know, he seems to be somebody who's unable and unwilling to explore other attitudes. He seems to be someone who's only interested in critiquing the church. He doesn't like Christian culture. And so these are big differences I share with him. And I believe he's operating as a Christian. But these are kind of the big things I see with Moore. What do you think? Share in the comments what you think about this. Where am I wrong? Where am I missing things? If you're in the team Winsome and it bothers you, these critiques, share your feedback. I want to hear from you. Next week on the podcast, we're going to have Glenn Moots, and we're going to talk about politics and Baptistic ecclesiology. And so you can look forward to that coming soon. Don't forget to sign up for the Patreon so you can get exclusive content that we're not publishing publicly. And until we talk with Glenn, see you next time. Have a great week.